Hi, Scott Dreyer here with DreyerCoaching.com, bringing you part 4 of an installment of a book series, book study, but an amazing book, which I've truly enjoyed and hope you'll enjoy as well, which is called Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Milton. And in the earlier parts, we looked at the end of World War II. There was a Yalta conference in February where Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Churchill went together in Yalta, the Soviet Union, make their plans for Germany and Europe after World War II. And out of Yalta, the idea was, how do we keep Germany from creating World War III in 20 years? It had been World War I in 1918, actually 1914 rather, ended in 1918. World War II in 39. How do we keep this, break this pattern of every 20 years having a world war that the Germans were involved in? And so the idea was, one of the ideas was divide Germany into 4 zones. Each allied power, Russia, England, France, America, got a zone. Moreover, the capital, Hitler's capital, was also to be divided into 4 zones. That brings us up to now. In April of 45, Hitler killed himself. On May 8th, Germany surrendered and the war was over in Europe. Now, the war was still continuing in Japan, but it was over on May 8th in Europe. In July of that year, there was another conference, this time in Potsdam. Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin, and it was held in this palatial residence. Now, if you remember from the Yalta conference, Stalin was there. He was the host at Yalta. And by Potsdam, he was in a great position because his army occupied the eastern half of Europe. Churchill was at Yalta, and he came back. But this man is new. Roosevelt had been at Yalta, but he was already in poor health. He'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. He died in April of that year. So when after Roosevelt died, Harry Truman became president. Harry Truman had only been president about 82 days. Even though Roosevelt had already won 4 elections, Vice President Wallace had been his vice president earlier. Because Wallace was more of a liberal, at the last minute, Roosevelt dumped Wallace and chose Harry Truman of Missouri to be his running mate. So Truman goes from being a U.S. senator to being a vice president. Within about 82 days, became president. So he was an unknown. So, whereas at Yalta, we were represented by Roosevelt, who had a world reputation, lifelong experience in political affairs, leadership. Truman was seen as a lightweight and an unknown. And also, for Churchill's sake, while he came to Potsdam in middle of July, England was having an election. This never made sense to me why this guy who was the hero who led England to World War II would get dumped a few months later, but that's what happened. There were these elections in July, which Churchill ended up losing. And so, ironically, Churchill came to Potsdam to represent England, but halfway through, when the election results were made known, the world realized Churchill had lost. So he had to go back home to England, and a man named Clement Attlee took over. So how bizarre. So, Stalin and Truman were still there. But this conference that began the 3rd week of July with Churchill ended by August 2nd with Churchill gone and Clement Attlee. And Ernest Bevin was his foreign secretary. So you can see Stalin came out smelling like a rose, as we say. So he was the only one who'd been there at Yalta because Roosevelt was dead. Truman was brand new, green, untested. And Churchill got dumped because that's the way politics works in democracies, and replaced by this man. Ernest Bevin was the foreign secretary, Clement Attlee. And these 2 men in the mid-late 40s after World War II more or less dissolved the British Empire. They let Palestine go, India go. They more or less oversaw the dissolution of the British Empire. So that's the Potsdam Agreement. So I want to read a little bit about Potsdam for you. This is from, again, the book Checkmate in Berlin, beginning on page 112. The Potsdam Conference was to begin in the 3rd week of July, 1945, 5 months after Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had last met for the discussions in Yalta. That previous conference had taken its toll on Roosevelt's declining health, and observers were shocked to see how frail the president looked upon his return to America. Yet he continued to pay close attention to the unfolding events in Europe and was outraged to learn that Stalin was already breaking his Yalta commitments. So outraged, indeed, that he sent the Soviet leader an indignant rebuke. The Soviet marshal replied by accusing the president of plotting a separate peace with Hitler. Roosevelt was incensed. Quote, "Frankly," he said, "I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment toward your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentation of my actions or those of my trusted subordinates." So to show you how shrewd this guy was, how evil, when Roosevelt called him out for breaking the Yalta agreements, he said, "Oh, you want to make a separate peace with Adolf Hitler." In fact, the book goes on to mention that because the Russians got to Berlin first, they found this German dentist who could prove by dental records that the dead body was Adolf Hitler. So the Russians had proof Hitler was dead, but they lied about it. They didn't tell the world. In fact, so later on, when England was calling out Russia for bad behavior, the Russians said, "Oh, we believe there are rumors or stories that you're harboring Adolf Hitler in the western part of Germany." Total lie, but just to deceive people. So that letter was Roosevelt's last communication with Stalin. On April 12th, he complained of suffering from a terrible headache. Shortly afterward, he collapsed unconscious and died within hours of a massive brain hemorrhage. He was 63 years of age. And a friend of mine we used to teach with, he said, "I believe it's fair to say Roosevelt was a war casualty from the stress of being president during the Great Depression and the stress of being president during World War II. Those things probably combined to kill the man." So my friend called him a war casualty. Let's continue the book. The new president was Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt's vice president of just 82 days, whose views on foreign policy were completely unknown, both to the American people and to America's wartime allies. Truman had no experience in foreign affairs and had only once ever traveled abroad, once on a troop ship in 1918. Interestingly enough, Truman, as a young man, so much wanted to serve in World War I, but he had poor vision. You see his glasses here. And he knew he'd failed the eye test. So he stood in line, and as he heard the medic give each man ahead of him an eye test, right, left, right, he memorized the pattern. So when it was his turn, he just parroted the pattern, not because he could see it, but just because he had memorized it. That was how desperate he wanted to serve his country, World War I. Harry Truman, kind of a side note there. So that was the Potsdam Conference. It was also during this time that Truman got word that the atomic bomb was ready to go. He gave a kind of a warning to Stalin, saying, "We have this new weapon that is unlike any other in the world." And at the moment, Stalin seemed to be unimpressed, like he didn't really understand the importance of that moment. But this book goes on to say, in fact, that after the meeting, Stalin did tell one of his aides, "Oh, we believe they're building a nuclear bomb." Also from Potsdam, Truman warned Japan of a new bomb and said, "You will risk, quote, destruction from the air unless you surrender immediately," which Japan thought was boasting and did not surrender. So that's called the Potsdam Conference. Now, let's go on we're going to flip from Europe back actually to Ottawa, Canada. This is now page 128. About a spy drama in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. 4,000 miles from Berlin, the curtain was lifting on an event so unforeseen and dramatic, it was to send shockwaves around the world. The prelude to the drama had taken place 2 days earlier when Igor Grzinsko, a cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, took the momentous decision to defect to the West. His move was unprecedented, the first defection of the post-war period, and was rendered all the more sensational by the fact that he had spent his final hours at the embassy stuffing 109 highly incriminating documents inside his shirt. With these documents, he hoped to create a sensation. So this man, Grzinsko, had been a party member young pioneers, all this training in Russia, and was dispatched to the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And keep in mind, during World War II, the Soviet Union and Canada, we were allies against the common enemy of Nazi Germany. Gazinsko was posted to the Soviet embassy in the summer of 1943. And it shows you how sneaky communism is. Operating under the code name Corby, he was given a frank resume of his work objectives, quote, the undermining of democratic countries from within, and the designing of a plan for delivering major crippling blows when the time becomes ripe. So even in 43, the war was still had 2 more years to go. Even though the Soviets and Canadians, we seemed to be allies, his orders were, be more or less be sneaky, and how do we undermine these democratic countries and take over, but when the time is ready, not prematurely. So the whole friendship talk was actually was dishonest. Gazinsko traveled to Canada with his wife, Svetlana, and their baby son, Andrei. After the deprivations of wartime Moscow, the prosperity of Ottawa proved a giddy revelation. The couple was mesmerized by the, quote, abundance of clothing, candies, and luxuries of all kinds. When Gazinko and Svetlana headed into downtown Ottawa, the gleaming automobiles, quote, left us gaping in astonishment. People also spoke their minds in a way that was inconceivable in Moscow. Freedom of speech, a novelty that was initially unsettling. As the weeks passed, the Gazinskos began to wonder how they might remain in this seeming paradise. Okay, so they began to like Canada real quick. And he worked at this embassy. He worked in room 12, which is the most secret place in the Soviet embassy. And it was all behind these guarded doors. And the inner sanctum had a smaller room inside, and that's where he worked on these incoming secret documents. Gazinsko's boss was a military attaché, Colonel Nikolai Zapotin, codenamed Giant, whose polished speech and well-groomed appearance hinted at his privileged background. His vodka shots were drunk to his favorite Berlin-inspired toast. To America, yesterday our allies, today our neighbors, tomorrow our enemies. So there again, you see this embassy official, in theory, Canada and Russia were allies. Be saying, hey, today allies, yesterday allies, today neighbors, tomorrow enemies. In this forbidden wing of the embassy, a radio blared music throughout the day in order to drown out conversations which might be overheard by others of the trusted unit. There was also a huge incinerator, big enough, said Gazinko, for the hurried destruction of large quantities of documents, codes, ciphers, telegrams, and dossiers on agents. When he expressed surprise at it, he was told, quote, the incinerator is big enough and powerful enough to consume the body of a man. The warning was clear. If he betrayed the embassy's secrets, he would end up inside it. So this guy, he works for a year, but he was increasingly troubled by the thought that his espionage was part of a big and threatening pattern designed to bring this Canada, this United States, this democracy under Soviet domination. So even during World War II, the Soviets were very clear, take over the West. As his passion for espionage waned, his attachment to Canada increased. He also continued to be seduced by the material abundance of Canada. He wanted to stay. He'd been in the country for 2 years when informed by Colonel Zapotin he was being recalled to Moscow. He was shocked. Quote, something happened inside me, he said. A strange voice spoke through my mouth. The dam I had built across my mind finally broke. When he returned to his wife that September evening, he was fizzing with excitement. Quote, we won't go back. But this was easier said than done. So how, as a Soviet spy, how do you not go home? How do you defect to Canada? Okay, I'm going to read this next couple pages because it's so incredibly well written, and also we'll just hear it word for word in Giles Morton's words. Igor Gazinko's route to treachery began on the evening of Wednesday, September 5th, 1945, when he left his apartment and headed to the Soviet embassy. There was nothing unusual about him working late, for telegrams to Moscow often had to be sent in the evening. Over the previous weeks, he had marked 109 documents that blew the lid on Soviet espionage, telegrams, notes, and memoranda that contained names and described spy planning or activities. These I marked by folding over the upper right corners. Gazinsko's intention was to smuggle these documents out of the embassy and take them to the editor of the Ottawa Journal newspaper, whom he trusted more than the police. That's interesting. After revealing their explosive content, he would ask for the editor's help in defecting. This is a real nail biter. So, and by the way, he also had evidence that there was a British scientist who was involved in the nuclear bomb project who was selling secrets to the Russians. So there's a British traitor that this Canadian was aware of. He arrived at the embassy a little after dusk, dressed in a blue suit and white shirt. He was sweating profusely and his nerves were on edge. His anxieties increased yet further when he discovered that Vitaly Pavlov was also working that night, one of his colleagues. Quote, "My blood seemed to freeze, but he remained composed as he headed to the cipher room. No one else was around, and he was able to take the incriminating documents from their folders." Quote, "I opened my shirt and carefully distributed the documents inside. The buttons bulged somewhat when he walked, but the evening was so warm, I felt a sloppy-looking shirt would not arouse undue interest." Leaving the building with these documents was to further test his nerves. One wrong move could mean the complete ruination of all of our plans. But he aroused no suspicions as he bid goodnight to the security guards and took a streetcar to the offices of the Ottawa Journal newspaper. Here it gets more nail-biting. Outside the building, I stopped to mop my brow and make sure nobody was following me. So far, so good. He entered the atrium and took the elevator to the 6th floor. And this is the point at which Gazinsko's plan hit a snag. The newspaper staff had left for the evening, and the only person on duty was an elderly night editor. I took out the stolen documents and spread them on the desk. As I did so, I explained who I was and that these were proof that the Soviet agents in Canada were seeking data on the atomic bomb. The night editor stared at the documents through his eyeglass, saw they were Russian, and shook his head. Quote, "This is out of our field," he said. "Sorry." He told the unwanted visitor to take him to the police. Aware of his need to plead his case to a senior official, a troubled Gazinko headed to the Ministry of Justice building in the hope of contacting anybody of importance. But the staff had left for the night, and the on-duty policeman said nothing could be done until morning. Gazinko had no option but to return home, where the embassy staff would probably discover the missing documents in the morning. He had just a few hours to make a new plan. He returned to the Ministry of Justice as soon as it opened. But although his story was listened to with some interest, the minister expressed no enthusiasm at seeing him in person. In growing desperation, Gazinko returned to the Ottawa Journal, this time with his wife and son, and secured a few minutes with a junior reporter. She looked through his documents and then showed them to the editor, but the outcome was the same. Quote, "I'm terribly sorry," she told him. "Your story doesn't seem to register here. Nobody wants to say anything but nice things about Stalin these days," because Stalin had been a World War II ally. Gazinko was fast losing hope. It was now early afternoon, time enough for the staff to have noticed the missing documents. He and his wife returned to their apartment and were relieved to find it untouched. But when Gazinko looked down at the street, he got a shock. Two men were seated on the bench in the park directly opposite, and both were looking at my window. A few minutes later, there was a bang at the door and a voice shouted his name. It was Lieutenant Lavtriev, Nikolai Zabutin's right-hand man from the embassy. The Gazinkos kept perfectly silent, biding their time. When they heard Lavtriev retreat downstairs, Gazinko dashed along the internal corridor and thumped on the door of his neighbor, Sergeant Harold Main. The sergeant listened sympathetically for his appeal for help. Quote, "Get your wife and boy, Gazinko, and bring them over here. I'm going to the police." As an officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force, Sergeant Maine knew the authorities would take him seriously. They did. 2 constables appeared within minutes and interviewed this would-be Soviet defector. Having accepted his story and credentials, they told him not to leave Sergeant Maine's apartment. Guzenko and his family were to be placed under immediate police protection. But he was still not out of danger. Later that night, 4 Soviet embassy staff could be heard smashing down Guzenko's front door. This is in Canada, by the way. So the Soviets are breaking down his door. The constables appeared within minutes and demanded to know what they were doing. One of them, the NKVD chief at secret police, Vitaly Pavlov, told them the apartment belonged to a member of the Soviet embassy staff. Quote, "He left some documents here and we have permission to look for them." After a furious row in which the constables accused Pavlov of breaking and entering, the Soviets angrily departed. Anyway, in sum, Guzenko was able to defect to Canada. He was given a secret identity and kind of lived the rest of his life in hiding. And it was very valuable information he brought to the West. Again, he showed that a British scientist was a traitor, and just showed that the Russians who claimed to be our friends in World War II, in fact, were out to get us. Okay, last little part here, page 134. So back in Berlin, Colonel Frank Cowley, he was the American commander of the American soldiers in that Berlin zone. Frank Cowley was unaware of Guzenko's defection, but he knew he would have to fight hard to save the German capital from Soviet domination. He was increasingly strident in his criticism of official American policy, which he described as, quote, appeasement of the Russians at any price in an attempt to win them over. He was also irritated by reminders from Washington that his role was to, quote, allay their suspicions and gain their friendship and cooperation. He had privately vowed to take a more combative approach, even if it meant crossing swords with the White House and State Department. Quote, there's only one way to deal with gangsters, Russian uniformed or otherwise, he said with a scowl, and that is to treat them like gangsters. He would later describe lying awake at night, quote, trying to think up ways to keep the Russians from stealing the city from under us. So Frank Cowley, even though he was getting messages from DC, oh, be nice to the Russians, they're our friends, don't upset them, he realized, wait a minute, what I'm seeing on the ground here is very, very different. And if we just appease and give in the same way the West appeased Hitler before 39, we'll get nowhere. Okay. So stay tuned. More to come.